An American senator tried to challenge British discipline and lost without a word. Welcome to our channel, where every story brings you closer to moments that truly matter. Today's tale isn't just about silence or tradition. It's about the kind of respect that transcends borders. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing how far our stories travel. And if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Tomorrow's episode is one you won't want to miss. Now let's begin. It was a gray morning in London, the kind where the drizzle doesn't fall. It just hangs in the air, clinging to every surface and softening the edges of even the grandest architecture. Buckingham Palace stood still beneath the mist, timeless and unmoved, as if waiting for something or someone. Through the massive wrought iron gates, a sleek black motorcade rolled in with quiet authority. Every glossy inch of the vehicles reflected the cloudy sky and the glistening pavement below. Tourists pressed against the barriers, phones held high, hoping to capture a glimpse of the power behind those tinted windows. From the lead car stepped Senator Robert J. Mercer, 44 years old, representing the state of Virginia. Tall, sharply, dressed in a navy overcoat, he adjusted his American flag lapel pin and took a long, slow look across the courtyard. He didn't wait for an aide with an umbrella. He didn't look up to admire the palace's grandeur. Instead, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for his staffer to hear, "Remind me again why we're treating this like a Renaissance fair?" His assistant, a young man barely out of graduate school, offered nothing more than a tight, polite smile. The kind of smile that says, "Please don't make this worse in public." Mercer was in London as part of a bipartisan U.S. delegation, here to discuss defense cooperation and shared global interests. It was supposed to be a formal, respectful visit. But the senator had little patience for ceremony. The uniforms, the polished rifles, the structured formations, to him it all felt excessive, unnecessary, outdated. As the group began their walk across the west courtyard, Mercer picked up his pace, boots crunching confidently on the gravel. A palace official walked beside them, offering commentary about the history of the changing of the guard. Mercer barely listened. His eyes were locked on something else. At the far end of the courtyard stood the unmistakable figures of the Queen's Guard. Tall men in bright red tunics, massive black bearskin hats perched atop their heads, white gloves gripping ceremonial rifles. To most visitors, they looked majestic, even mythical. To Mercer, they looked like actors. "You know what doesn't win wars?" he muttered, glancing sideways at his aide. "Theater." The staffer said nothing, wisely. Mercer's gaze lingered, on one guard in particular. He didn't know the man's name, not yet, but there was something about him. He stood perfectly still, as if carved from the same stone beneath his feet. Rain beaded on his shoulders, but he didn't move. Not even to blink. That was Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Brooks, 33, born in Kansas, raised in a family of military men going back to World War II. Brooks had served in Iraq, trained with NATO forces in Germany, and led security operations in Mali. His appointment to ceremonial duty wasn't a reward. It was a recognition of unshakable discipline. To Mercer, though, he was just another piece of palace theater. The senator stopped, narrowed his eyes, and tilted his head. "That guy hasn't blinked once," he scoffed. He stepped off the designated visitor path, veering just slightly, but noticeably, toward Brooks. A few of his aides exchanged glances. A veteran in the crowd frowned, recognizing the look in Mercer's eyes, a blend of arrogance and curiosity, the kind that tests boundaries just to see what breaks. And so, in the rain-soaked stillness of Buckingham Palace, a collision of two worlds quietly began to unfold. One, a man who believed rank demanded obedience. The other, a soldier who knew silence could speak louder than any command. Senator Robert J. Mercer stood still for a moment, his gaze fixed on the motionless figure. Ahead, Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Brooks, There was something about the man's stillness that gnawed at Mercer. It wasn't the uniform. Mercer had already dismissed that as costume. And it wasn't the rifle. He'd seen real weapons in real wars. No, it was the discipline, the deliberate, unsettling calm that seemed to stand in silent defiance of Mercer's very presence. And Mercer hated being ignored. The senator took a slow step forward. Then another. The gravel crunched underfoot, echoing unnaturally loud in the wet courtyard. His entourage lagged behind, clearly unsure whether to follow or pretend this wasn't happening. Cameras stopped clicking. Conversations halted. Even the rain seemed to hush. A British officer nearby stiffened, subtly shifting his posture, ready to intervene but unsure if he should. Visitors at the barrier watched with growing unease, their attention now locked on Mercer like an audience waiting for the moment the tightrope walker slips. Then Mercer spoke. "Tell me something," he called out, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "Do you actually do anything? Or is this just dress-up day at the museum?" A few tourists chuckled nervously. A woman in a trench coat gave a sharp shake of her head. Near the back, a group of British veterans stood watching, silently, arms folded, expressions unreadable. Mercer circled Brooks slowly, hands behind his back like a school principal inspecting a student. His voice dripped with sarcasm. "They say you're a real soldier," he said, tilting his head. "But I don't see it. You look more like a wax figure at Madame Tussauds." Still, Brooks didn't move. Not a flinch, not a blink. Mercer leaned, closer. "I served too, you know," he said, tapping the flag pin on his lapel. "I wore the uniform. We salute rank where I'm from. That's how chain of command works." He paused. "Salute me," he said sharply. "That's an order." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Tourists gasped. One man instinctively pulled his daughter behind the rope. A woman in a military widow's pin whispered, "He did not just say that." But Brooks remained frozen, eyes forward, posture perfect. His silence was deafening, a refusal, yes, but one carved from something deeper than pride. It was purpose. Mercer's jaw clenched. "I'm giving you a direct order, soldier," he barked. "Salute me, now." Then he did the unthinkable. He stepped closer, violating the unspoken but sacred buffer between soldier and spectator. His shoulder brushed the edge of Brooks's rifle. He leaned in, his voice a low growl. "You know what disobeying a superior gets you where I'm from? A reprimand or worse." That was the final straw. In one smooth, deliberate motion, Brooks moved. His white-gloved hand rose slowly, not in salute, but in control. He calmly placed it between himself and Mercer, gently pushing the senator's arm away from the rifle's proximity. The motion wasn't aggressive. It wasn't rushed. It was precise. Then, without turning his head, still locked in perfect attention, Brooks spoke. "Sir," he said, voice low and even, every syllable sharp as steel, "you are in direct violation of Standing Palace Protocol, Section Bravo. I must respectfully instruct you to return to the designated visitor path." The words landed like hammer blows in the quiet. Mercer stepped back, startled, blinking as if he'd just been slapped. He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. "You knew." The crowd was dead silent. Even his aides looked frozen. The entire courtyard felt like it was holding its breath. Brooks didn't move again. He didn't need to. The senator had issued a command and been answered, not with a salute, but with something far more powerful: discipline, dignity, and the authority of silence. For a few long seconds, Senator Robert Mercer didn't move. He stood there in the rain, staring at the man who had just, without raising his voice or even turning his head, put him back in his place. It wasn't a shove. It wasn't disrespectful. But somehow it hit harder than any confrontation Mercer had experienced on a Senate floor. His mouth opened like he might object, but no words came out. Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Brooks was already back in position, rifle at rest, eyes forward, body still as stone. It was as if the encounter hadn't even happened. But it had, and everyone had seen it. The courtyard was absolutely silent, the kind of silence that only happens when something crosses a line. Behind the barriers, tourists stood motionless, unsure if they were supposed to clap, gasp, or just pretend they hadn't witnessed a public humiliation. A teenage boy near the back whispered to his friend, "Yo, that dude just got owned." But Mercer wasn't done. Not yet. His pride, his American pride, burned too hot for that. He took a step forward again, this time planting himself directly in Brooks' line of sight. His voice was low, tight. "You really think standing there like a statue makes you a better soldier?" he asked, venom creeping in. "You ever face a real threat, or do you just play pretend out here for the cameras?" From the edge of the crowd, a retired British colonel, chest full of medals, narrowed his eyes. He didn't say a word, but his posture said enough. Mercer pressed on, louder now, as if raising his voice could regain control of the moment. "Where I come from, soldiers know when to act. We don't just stand around looking pretty in the rain." He gestured broadly at the uniform. This is theater, not service." And that's when it happened. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not anger, not outrage, respect. First, a man in his 70s, dressed in a dark navy blazer, stepped forward near the barrier. A veteran. You could tell by the way he walked, measured, precise. He stopped just short of the rope, straightened his back, and raised his hand. A perfect textbook salute. No words. No applause. Just recognition. Then another joined him. A younger man, early 40s. Possibly ex-military himself. Then a woman in a red coat, tears in her eyes. Then an American. An older gentleman with a U.S. Marine pin on his collar, nodding. Solemnly before delivering the same silent gesture. They weren't saluting the flag. They weren't saluting the crown. They were saluting the discipline of one man who didn't break. Brooks didn't acknowledge a single one. That was the point. The silence was the salute. Mercer watched it unfold, expression frozen. For the first time, his body language shifted, just a little. Shoulders tighter, jaw clenched. His aides began to stir, sensing it was time to intervene, but no one dared move yet. Because somehow, in the absence of motion, everything was moving. The moment had slipped from Mercer's control, not with a bang, but with a calm so steady it became deafening. The senator's authority, his presence, felt suddenly small next to a man who hadn't said more than 2 sentences. He looked down at his polished shoes, now damp with London rain. Then back at Brooks, still standing like a monument carved, from principle. For a man who valued dominance, Mercer was starting to realize he was being outranked by silence, and the world was watching. Senator Robert Mercer didn't blink. But his confidence had cracked. Just a hairline fracture. Invisible to most but unmistakable to anyone who had seen a man lose control of a moment he thought he owned. And now, it was Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Brooks, the man who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken more than a dozen words, who had seized that moment without lifting a finger. Still, Mercer stood his ground, trying to piece back together the illusion of authority. He drew a breath, straightened his shoulders, and then spoke louder, like he was commanding a room that no longer existed. "I'm Senator Robert Mercer, United States Armed Services Committee. I've worn the uniform. I know what protocol looks like." He paused, waiting for that to carry weight. It didn't. "I asked for a simple show of respect. A salute, that's not a request, it's alliance protocol." He tapped his lapel pin again, like that tiny American flag was a badge of command. But even that gesture felt hollow now. The only response was Brooks's silence, still strong, unshaken. Then a new presence entered the courtyard. Captain Eliza Wren, Palace Protocol Officer. Mid-40s, tall, angular, and every inch the embodiment of controlled command. Her boots moved cleanly through the damp gravel, cutting a path directly toward the brewing storm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She simply arrived, like gravity itself had entered the courtyard. "Senator Mercer," she said, her tone even. "May I have a word?" It wasn't a question. Mercer turned toward her, likely expecting confrontation or defensiveness. What he got instead was something far sharper, civility laced with steel. "I understand there may have been some confusion regarding ceremonial boundaries," she began. guiding him a few steps away with an open palm. A subtle gesture, but everyone, from the crowd to the colonel to the children behind the barrier, knew what it meant. You've crossed the line, and now we're cleaning it up. Wren's words were clipped and precise, honed like a NATO briefing. Room statement. Palace guards are sworn to the crown. While on post, their authority exceeds that of any visiting official, elected or otherwise, including senators. That one hit. Mercer's brows twitched. Staff Sergeant Brooks, she continued, nodding toward the still figure behind them, is not a decorative fixture. He's a combat veteran. 2 deployments in Iraq, 1 in Mali, joint operations with American Marines. Bronze Star, mentioned in dispatches for field leadership under direct fire. Her voice was calm, but each fact landed like a hammer striking stone. He's not ignoring you, Senator. He's protecting you by upholding the standards of his post. Behind her, another figure approached. Quiet, deliberate. Brigadier Charles Halford, commander of the Household Division. Fewer medals than Mercer, but the man wore years on his face, years of real command, real loss, real field decisions. His presence didn't ask for respect, it assumed it. Senator, Halford said with crisp formality, our guards are trained to operate in both ceremonial and combat environments without breaking stride. Their ability to remain still under pressure, especially during deliberate provocation, is not a weakness. It is discipline, it is principle. Mercer exhaled slowly. He was losing ground, not just politically but personally. He'd stepped into a culture he thought he understood, and found himself surrounded by people who didn't need to raise their voices to prove they had power. For a long moment, he didn't say a word. Then he looked back at Brooks. Still, silent. Stronger than any command Mercer could issue, and somehow that silence had become a mirror, not of weakness, but of what respect really looks like when it doesn't need to speak at all. For a man like Senator Robert Mercer, retreat was never part of the plan. He had walked into Buckingham Palace expecting reverence, or at least deference, but now, standing in the soft London mist, he found himself outmatched not by rank, not by rhetoric, but by a man who hadn't even moved. Behind him, the crowd remained hushed, watching with quiet reverence. Even the clicking of phones had stopped. No one dared break the tension, not because they feared chaos, but because they recognized something sacred had just taken place. Mercer looked once more at Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Brooks, still standing exactly where he'd been all along, rifle at rest, chin level, gaze fixed forward at that eternal 45-degree angle, not looking at anyone, yet somehow seeing everything. And then something unexpected happened. A man in a blazer, a British war veteran by the look of his ribbons, stepped forward from the watching crowd. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He walked up to the rope line, stopped precisely 3 feet back, and slowly raised his right hand in a crisp textbook salute. Brooks didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge, didn't break. But the message had already landed. One by one, others followed. A younger man in a leather coat, maybe ex-army. A woman with silver hair and steady posture, hand pressed firmly to her brow. Then an American, a Marine by the look of his bearing. Stepping forward quietly, eyes locked on Brooks, offering a salute not from loyalty to a flag, but from one soldier to another. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't even a reaction to Mercer. It was recognition. Mercer saw it, and this time he didn't speak. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed together. His aides hovered behind him, unsure whether to move in or let him stew in silence. For once, no one reached for a microphone. No one looked for a camera. The moment didn't belong to politics. It belonged to dignity. Captain Wren stepped to Mercer's side again, her voice calm, her words precise. These men are not here to entertain. They are not here to salute rank. They are here to represent the crown, the military, and the very idea that some roles demand unwavering stillness, even in the face of confrontation. Mercer didn't respond, but the fight had left his shoulders. Brigadier Halford stepped forward with finality. What you witnessed today, Senator, is not defiance. It is control. What you challenged was not a man, but a system older than either of us, a discipline rooted in centuries. And what you received was grace." He paused, then added with a nod, "There will be no disciplinary action, if you were wondering. The only thing broken here, sir, was expectation." Mercer looked once more at Brooks, still motionless, still flawless. And something changed. He didn't apologize, he didn't nod, but he did step back just once. It wasn't defeat, but it was something close to humility. As the motorcade was called forward, Mercer walked slowly toward the vehicle, saying nothing. His hand hesitated on the car door. He glanced back, just once, at the man who had silenced him with nothing but resolve. Behind the rope line, the crowd began to shift, a few whispers now replacing the sacred silence. Someone said, "That's a story I'll be telling for years." Another replied, "He never even blinked." And that's what stuck, because in the end, Brooks didn't need a weapon, or a voice, or a salute. He had something stronger, principle, and, for once, that was enough to quiet a man who thought volume equaled power. The rain softened again, like the palace itself had exhaled, and there, on the ancient stones of history, a single soldier stood still, unshaken, unmoved, a living monument to what true strength really looks like. As Senator Robert Mercer stepped into the waiting vehicle, the soft thunk of the door closing seemed to echo louder than it should have. Inside, the air felt thicker, heavier, like the weight of what had just happened was pressing in from every side. No one spoke, not his aides, not the driver, not even Mercer himself. Outside, the palace courtyard was slowly returning to its normal rhythm. Tourists began to murmur again, uncertain whether they'd witnessed a diplomatic embarrassment or something far more profound. But in one quiet corner of the barrier, a group of British veterans remained behind, unmoving, hands clasped, eyes locked on the red figure in the courtyard. Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Brooks hadn't moved a muscle, still at full attention, still the very definition of composure. He had held the line, not just physically, but morally. He had done what his uniform demanded, even in the face of a senator's ego, and that kind of resolve, it lingered. A man, in his 60s, blazer pinned with faded campaign ribbons, slowly stepped forward. He didn't salute this time. He simply stood there, breathing steady, and whispered under his breath, "My father would have been proud to see this." Younger veteran nodded beside him, replying softly. He didn't flinch, not once. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Back inside the motorcade, Mercer finally broke the silence. His voice was low, tight, but not angry anymore. Just unsettled. He stood there like the damn wind didn't exist, he muttered. One of his aides cleared his throat. "Sir, should we prepare a statement?" Mercer shook his head slowly. "No, that's not what this is." He paused, his eyes fixed out the rain-streaked window. "This isn't about optics anymore." Across the courtyard, Captain Eliza Wren remained standing near the side entrance, arms folded, watching Mercer's vehicle from a distance. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even focused on Mercer anymore. She was watching Brooks, because she knew what it took to hold that kind of posture under direct pressure, not just physical endurance, but psychological restraint, the kind that only comes from years of training, experience, and the kind of quiet pride most people will never understand. As the last few visitors began to disperse, a father with 2 small children lingered. The older one, maybe 10, tugged at his dad's sleeve. "Why didn't he talk, Daddy?" The man knelt, lowering his voice. "Because sometimes, son, not talking says more than shouting ever could." The child nodded slowly, the moment embedding in his young memory like stone. Then came the final gesture, subtle, spontaneous, and unforgettable. A woman in her 40s, American by the sound of her accent, walked toward the barrier. She didn't wave. She didn't take a selfie. She just stood still for a moment, then placed her hand over her heart, not in patriotism, in respect. And Brooks still didn't move, Because the truth is, moments like this aren't about the man being honored. They're about what he represents. Discipline, restraint, the unshakable calm in a world full of noise. As the motorcade pulled away, taillights glowing faintly through the mist, Mercer looked back one last time. His eyes met the figure in red, unmoved, unchanged. The senator didn't salute, didn't wave, but he didn't scoff either. He simply nodded. Once, no words, because maybe, for the first time, he understood. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned. And sometimes it's earned by standing perfectly still, in the pouring rain, while the world around you tries to shake your focus. And fails. As the motorcade disappeared into the fog-draped London streets, the palace courtyard slowly returned to its sacred stillness. But something hung in the air, something unspoken, almost holy. Not tension, not embarrassment, reverence. Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Brooks remained in his position, unchanged. Rain traced down his bearskin hat. His grip on the SA-80 rifle was still precise, as if carved into him. But the silence around him had transformed. It was no longer the silence of confrontation. Now, it was honor. Inside the palace, Captain Eliza Wren stood at a side window, her hands clasped behind her back. She watched the empty courtyard with the eyes of someone who had seen battles not on fields, but in boardrooms, behind closed NATO briefings where power is quiet and control is everything. She knew this moment would never make headlines. There'd be no official photos, no political fallout, just a story, passed down from one soldier to another, told with lowered voices and a sense of pride that didn't need recognition. Across town, in the embassy's briefing room, Senator Mercer would eventually recount the incident with a filtered tone. He wouldn't speak of being silenced, only of a cultural misunderstanding. But deep down, even he would know. He hadn't been dismissed. He'd been shown something, stronger than status. And somewhere, maybe years from now, a child would walk past a ceremonial guard, ask why they don't smile or move. And someone, somewhere, would tell the story. There was a man who tried to provoke one, tried to command a salute, and the guard didn't move, because sometimes, not moving is the boldest move of all. No medals were handed out that day. No speeches were given, but in that rain-slicked courtyard, where history lives in every stone, a line was drawn, not in anger, not in defiance, but in discipline. And Brooks? He just stood there, a single red figure in a sea of gray, proof that sometimes the quietest men carry the loudest truths. What would you have done in that moment? Do you believe silence can speak louder than words? That true discipline doesn't need to shout to be heard? We want to hear your thoughts. Was Senator Mercer justified in expecting a salute as an ally? Or did Staff Sergeant Brooks show us all what unwavering respect and duty truly look like? Let us know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? And more importantly, how do you interpret what happened in that courtyard? Was it about tradition, about ego, or about something deeper, something timeless? We believe stories like this matter because they remind us that honor doesn't always come with a spotlight, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stand still. So if this story made you pause, made you reflect, or even just made you feel something real, drop your thoughts below. We read every single comment, and your perspective helps keep this channel alive with meaning and heart. And remember, the next story is coming tomorrow. Don't miss it. Hit subscribe and join the conversation, because sometimes silence deserves to be heard.